Morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. Thank you so much for stopping in and taking in this webinar today. So my name is Kim Everhart. I'm a member of the marketing team here at Percona, and I'm really excited to have you join us for the State of Open Source Databases with our CXO, Matt Yonkovit. And before I turn it over to Matt, I'm just going to go through a few simple housekeeping items. So everybody is muted, but we totally welcome your questions. So please feel free to drop them into the questions box. And at the end, if we have time, we'll address them. If we don't have time, I'll send them off and we'll get them answered, and then we'll put them in a blog post in the future along with the recording of this webinar. So to answer that question, yes, this is being recorded and everyone will get a copy as long as you registered. It should go out within the next 24 hours. So other than that, I'm pretty excited for this topic. I haven't heard Matt speak on this yet, and this is actually a roundup of a 4-blog series. I will drop that blog link into the chat window after we get started in case anybody missed it and wants to check it out. So Matt, if you're ready, I'd love to turn it over to you.
Yep. Thanks everybody for coming today. I appreciate it. And so we're here to talk about the state of open source databases. If you've attended Percona Live in the past couple of years, Peter and I have both talked about the trends and things that are happening in the industry. And so we're going to continue that discussion right now. And so if you haven't read my blog, please take a look at that. But let's get right into it. So I wanted to start with the industry trends and the things that are impacting the database industry and the tech industry as a whole to start with. And we can't start without talking about the impact of COVID-19 and the coronavirus, right? So we did a poll of our user base recently, and what we found was that people fall into one of 3 categories, and it's interesting because there's a group, the vast majority of people, about 50%, are kind of doing the same level of traffic, the same work that they were doing before. But then there's these 2 really extreme opposites, right? So we've got one group that is seeing a significant decrease where, massive amounts of traffic have, decreased, they're not seeing much. And then you're seeing this other group that is seeing the biggest stress test in the history of their application and of their systems. And so, you see these extreme opposites, and they have very, very different impacts on the customers and users of their systems. And so we're starting to see that impact, be called out in the press. So I don't know if you've been paying attention to any of these articles, but we're getting articles on COVID-19 broke the internet. It didn't break the internet. The internet's doing strong. Oh, the cloud is broken. There doesn't seem to be consistency, and part of that is because it depends on who you ask and who you're looking at. And if you look over the last few months, and this is just actually in April. Okay, so if we look just in April in terms of outages and slowdowns, you still see outages and slowdowns with people's systems and with their technology stacks, right? And so is this caused by COVID-19? Is this caused by people who are hitting more their website and their applications more frequently? It's hard to say, but you see Google Cloud had issues, Amazon had issues, Microsoft had issues, Snapchat had issues. I mean, we're all using Zoom and teleconferencing. I'm sure we've all experienced slowdowns with those systems as well. And a lot of companies are spending a lot of time, money, and effort to fix these systems. But here's the thing, if you go back 1 year and you look a year ago, the headlines from a year ago are almost identical to the headlines right now, right? So Facebook had issues, Google had issues, AWS had issues, Microsoft had issues, Reddit had issues. I mean, like all of these companies had issues a year ago when I did a talk that was similar to this at Percona Live that they do now. And so while COVID-19 has kind of exposed, some companies, systems, the fact that people are still demanding that their systems stay up and they're available and they're still mission critical and they're still critical to the infrastructure, it's not new. It's existed for years. And we're seeing that, as companies grow, even organically outside of this COVID-19 environment, this is incredibly important to have systems that scale and systems that stay up. And you will always see that being available whenever a customer wants it and whenever they need you, and being available in a speedy, rapid time frame is critical, and you will never see that go away. People want what they want, and they want it now. right? And so that is something we need to deal with. Now, despite all of these issues, and despite all of these, outages and slowdowns and things that are happening across the internet, tech companies are booming, especially in the cloud space, right? So Google, AWS, Microsoft, all their profits from cloud services are up, right? And they're up pretty big, and they continue to see that revenue roll in. And we're seeing that adoption in the cloud continue to increase, and people are still looking to modernize their applications, right? Massive growth across all the cloud providers. Modernization efforts continue, and a lot of people, because of COVID-19, had to accelerate those modernization efforts, right? So people who weren't, equipped to, perform online, or were resistant to moving things, to a digital format, now they have to. And so we're still seeing that adoption rise. Now, as we start to, move more to the cloud, and as we start to have to face those issues with scalability and with, making sure that systems stay up and, that they're fast enough to process, what's the new way to default, scale your database? And this has changed in this new modern industry, because right now, a lot of people, the new default to scale is by swiping your credit card, right? It's by paying more. Because in the cloud system, it's a consumption-based model. I just need to add more resources, click a button, all of a sudden your credit card's charged. And this is something that we're also tracking as a scary trend. In fact, we did another poll of our user base, and we asked how many times they had to upgrade their systems in the last couple of years. And 41% of people said more than 6 times. And what's scary about this, when we talk about, database as a service or cloud providers, when you move from one tier to the next tier, typically they double the resources and they double the spend. So if you're doing a 6-time increase on a server, that has the potential to be 51x what you originally had planned to spend. That's massive, right? And now some of this could be disk, some of it could be other resources, but you have to be careful, because it is very easy to just, continue to increase those costs. And this has led to a lot of people wondering, is cloud the new lock-in, right? Is it the Hotel California? Can you check in, but you can never leave, and it just keeps us on, incurring, your room service bills. And this has led to this other trend that is, tracking across the industry. And, these are just headlines from the last month again, right? Multi-cloud. Cloud, right? So it's no longer just a single cloud. People are looking for ways to deploy across multiple clouds, not only to protect against those scaling issues when, service providers have issues, but also to help protect that scale by credit card mentality, right? Keeping, the vendors kind of pitted against each other, seeing if they can make sure that they can jump on whatever costs the least amount or who has the most resources available. In this multi-cloud world, is starting to develop, and it's a reality, and it's the new normal. But when you look at this means that things are getting more complicated, not less complicated. So part of the benefit of the cloud is decomplicating things, and now all of a sudden we're seeing some more complications arise. And you can't turn around without seeing even the cloud providers starting to jump on this trend. Whether it's Anthos now supporting multi-cloud from Google, right? Anthos is their Kubernetes play. This allows them to, run Google services in AWS, right? Or in Azure eventually. So you're going to see that multi-cloud space evolve and continue. And this is something that we've seen in our own data. So our survey, our annual survey last year, we saw that, while 30% of businesses were already multi-cloud, 41% of enterprises or large companies were already multi-cloud. And 61% were hybrid environments, right? So this is not a new trend. This is something that's continuing to accelerate. But now we're starting to see more and more of this play out in the press. Now, this multi-cloud world has led to a whole bunch of new buzzwords, right? And a whole bunch of new technologies. But the ones you're hearing more and more about are containers, Kubernetes, and cloud native, right? Think of those as the big words. We've all heard about them. And when we talk about containers, Kubernetes, and cloud native, these are really developed to let you run anywhere on any platform, to give you that portability and to start to move you around. And a lot of people think, containers though, and Kubernetes is not for databases. But this is a survey that Datanami did in 2019. And they found that the number 2 application deployed to containers is databases. And we've seen this with other surveys as well and other data. So the fact that containerization and databases are now starting to go hand in hand, and that Kubernetes environment and databases are going hand in hand, it's something that you have to take note of. And this is where we see a lot of the future trending happen. So as all of this multi-cloud space and technology space starts to evolve, what do database companies think about this, right? So there's classic database companies as well as our cloud vendors. Well, they're not so happy about it, right? So we've seen that, like, a lot of name calling and a lot of angst amongst database providers towards cloud providers in the past year or two. And so this has led to different responses. And it's kind of interesting because we see like this big split where we've got some database companies going, we're going to be fully open. And then we've got other database companies going, we're going to be less open. We're going to be restrictive because we're so worried about the cloud and what's impacting, the cloud space and our database business, right? So we've got Mongo on one side, we've got Cloudera on another, trying different things. So when you think, and I'll ask you, what when you think, of what open source is and what do you expect from it? I know, like, a lot of people that I talk to, they think free, they think cost effective, they think modifiable, they think flexible, they think, very, open, and you could just do whatever you want with it, right? But what's happening is now we're seeing these new licenses evolve, and it restricts some of that. And I like to call this the licensing buffet. I came up with this analogy because I had 2.5, 3 weeks in Vegas last year, and after 2.5, 3 weeks in Vegas, you've hit every buffet in Vegas, and you've eaten all this different food, and you realize that, like, things are different depending on where you go. And this equated to licensing for me, right? When you think about most people's expectations around the free and open licensing, or an MIT license, license, you're thinking about this free, all-you-can-eat buffet where you can get whatever you want and you can sample the different things and you can try them different ways and different combinations with no restrictions. But then most open source businesses have been built around in the past an open core model, which is kind of like a free continental breakfast with a hot paid upgrade, right? So if you want your toast, you want your cereal, you could totally have that. But if you want the eggs and bacon, you got to pay a little more. And so that's been a classic model that MySQL has made popular. Mongo, all the open source vendors have followed that initially. But as the cloud has started to disrupt that, other technology, other licenses have started to come up. So now we see open source with restrictions, right? You can run this except if you're a cloud provider, or you can run this unless you, are running it on a Tuesday with the full moon. This is kind of like your buffet with a free buffet with a minimum 10 drink purchase. But you also have source available, right? Which is the source is available to you. The source you can download, you can look at it, you can change it, but you really can't do anything with it. It's sort of kind of free. And this is a look before you buy type of a license. You also have eventual open source, where you can buy three things free and three things, and then you get one free, right? But you also have the consumption-based model, which is the buffet where you pay per pound, which is what cloud providers follow. And then there's this new one that's starting to kind of flow out, which is the open source compatible moniker, which isn't open source at all, right? And so you see a lot of cloud providers, they'll take the open source software, they'll modify it, but they don't want to release that as open source, or they can't. So they'll claim it as open source compatible, right? And this is kind of a weird one, because it's kind of like saying, hey, that open source, software over there, we're just like that, only better, but trust us, we're really open, but you can't see anything behind the scenes. So, you're getting this evolution in this license space, and it's causing a lot of confusion as well. So what's driving these licensing changes, though? And this is what's important, right? It's money, right? It is the business model of a lot of database vendors, and this is being disrupted by new trends in cloud computing, multi-cloud, in Kubernetes, all these different areas. Let's take a look at, MongoDB Atlas, for instance, okay? MongoDB Atlas is the business model for MongoDB going forward. It really is. It's the database as a service is where all database vendors want to move to. If you look at the growth in Atlas customers versus non-Atlas customers, and this is from their earnings call, so I went through and I pulled, the numbers. You can see that, the growth in Atlas is where it's at. This is where they're promoting, this is where they're investing, this is where they're putting their dollars, right? And that's great because database as a service is wonderful for a lot of reasons, right? It enables developers to move quicker. It enables customers to spin up things and gain access to technologies they might not have expertise in. It overcomes the skill gaps. It speeds your releases. It's just easier, right? For a lot of people. And it helps standardize across multiple systems. You'll get the same consistent environment, and you don't have to worry about those inconsistencies. So there's a lot of benefits. But again, this gets back to that scale by credit card. It's the same thing that happens in the cloud space, right? And what we've found is more and more people end up paying more than they actually need to, okay? And this is where it's, important for us, to be mindful of this, okay? And many times people make this jump to database as a service and their costs increase as opposed to decrease. And that's kind of intentional because if you don't understand how like the X as a service, whether it's database as a service or software as a service models work, they are predicated on you actually spending more. They're predicated on expansion, right? You start small and you will grow. That's how these models are built. And when you understand that, that's not like, oh, I'm going to buy 10 servers and then next year I'll buy 10 more servers. No, the expectation is you're going to buy 10 servers. Next year you're going to buy 12. The year after that, you're going to buy 15. The year after you're going to buy 20. And these, vendors are very open about this. In fact, again, go back to the earnings calls for either Elastic or Mongo. They call out the number of expansion, 21 quarters in a row of 120% expansion, right? 11 quarters for Elastic in a row of net expansion on their customer base. It's the model that you're moving into. And that expansion comes in a few different forms. Sometimes the expansion is based on new services that you bought. You've seen so much value, you've bought some new stuff. They've introduced new products, right? Again, that's great. Other times it's based on, raising prices. You just don't know. But again, the way that these models work, it's all about the expansion, and you have to realize that. So, looking at cloud and RDS, for example, there was this great blog at the end of last year where somebody had, kind of put 2 and 2 together, and they looked at what's the cost of EC2 and what's the cost of RDS? What's the incremental cost difference? And over time, you would expect that to decrease, but the numbers that he pulled and the examples that he was giving were really telling because it didn't decrease, it increased, right? So instead of paying a premium of 33% for running database as a service, now you're paying a premium of 75%. So why is database as a service so popular? And part of this is explained by the shifting demographic of who's making decisions around technologies and where things are being run. It used to be when I started as a DBA, I started with the premise of hey, we're a Oracle shop or we're a SQL Server shop, and you might have a few other databases, but they were typically like, we don't want to talk about it. And I still hear that from people that I talk to. But now we're starting to see a demographic shift where the DBAs or the IT and the infrastructure folks aren't choosing the technology anymore. We're seeing the developers and architects, those who are building the applications, get to choose the technology stacks that they use. And that introduces new databases. It introduces new technologies that no one had ever planned to support. And it causes all kinds of weird nuances, right? And so this is a technology inheritance issue, I like to call it. This technology inheritance issue is where these development teams, the architecture teams, what they're doing is they're deciding on this technology. They're picking Postgres, they're picking Maria, they're picking Mongo, right? And then these IT departments who maybe they were an Oracle shop before, now all of a sudden they have to support Mongo. Now they have to support Maria. Now they have to support Postgres. Now they have to support all these, right? And this has led to a massive growth in the number of technologies that infrastructure teams have to support, right? And this type of trend has been happening for the last few years, and this has really been enabled by easier access to technology, right? As a developer, I can start off by going out, spinning up a couple of instances in Amazon or Azure or Google. I can add databases. I can add different X as a service or platform as a service components. I can build an application without ever having to talk to the IT team. And so now we're seeing that more and more occur more and more. And it's the same thing with a lot of the cloud native technologies. a lot of applications are being developed in-house, even on-prem with Kubernetes, and people want to be able to run their instances like they run their applications, or their databases like they run their applications through a Kubernetes, through a cloud native type interface. So they'll go download an operator from someone, they'll plug it in, they'll click a button, and all of a sudden they have their own database running. Again, it's about enabling that quick turnaround. But this leads to all kinds of additional issues, because now you've got databases that people aren't skilled in. They don't know how to handle. They don't understand the performance nuances. They don't understand the security issues, the unplanned downtime, how to prevent that. And so that's where there's a lot of reliance on the cloud providers and a lot of the database as a service providers. But there is some shared responsibility there, and that's often misunderstood. But I want to focus on one thing here, right? Because security. Okay. Now, a year ago, I presented this slide at Percona Live, and we talked about the security issues. And there were billions of records released, leaked all over the internet, including my data at least 7 times, because I know that because I've gotten 7 offers from companies who accidentally leaked my data to monitor my credit. Right now, if there was a secondary market for selling my free credit monitoring, I would be a rich man, because it continued on to this year. But last year we saw all of these issues, right? So a year ago, and a lot of these issues that we see here on the screen, right? These issues were caused by simple things, not running an updated version, running an unpatched version. Number one problem, not running with a password, having a blank password, right? Oh my God, I mean, that's the easiest. So fast forward a year, what do we see? This is just this month, okay? This month. We still see the data being leaked. And what's funny is it's the same issues, and it's the same type of setup. People who don't know how to set up their databases, don't know how to set up, specific technology stacks, they're inheriting things or getting things. Oops, I left the default password on. Oops, I left it, blank. Oops, I forgot to update this because I forgot we even had that database. These things happen all the time, and this continues to happen. And this is a trend that we need to get a hold of, because I don't need any more credit monitoring apps, right? I don't need any more free, credit monitoring. Please keep my data safe. I think that's a mandate we all have to do in the database industry. So the 7 trends to watch for that I've covered here, right? Just to kind of recap, right? We've got this technology inheritance problem, which has led to things like massive cloud growth, but also this growth of the multi-cloud and the hybrid, because we've seen rising costs and rising complexity on those cloud providers. We've seen outages and slowdowns. We've seen this leaky data, right? All of these things are things that we have to be mindful of as we look at where the database industry is headed. How do we get a hold of that, ahead of these? How do we prevent them from happening? Now, I want to talk a little bit about the popularity of databases, right? The various open source databases. We're going to focus on the ones that we are experts in, because we have a little bit more insight, but we'll touch on a few of the others as well. So let's start with open source in general. And I think that no one is arguing that open source is popular and it's just getting more popular, right? So Red Hat did their open source survey, and they're showing that 95% of those in the enterprise think that open source is strategically important. So yes, we agree, the industry agrees, open source is where it's at. Now, 77% of respondents to their survey said that open source is going to continue to grow within their organizations. Right, great, growth. Now, when we talk specifically on the database side, looking at a couple other database specific trends, we look at DB Engines, and DB Engines has a great graph where they track the popularity of open source versus proprietary technologies or databases, and you can see that over time, open source has closed the gap on commercially licensed databases, and it's almost reached the point where it's a crossover. Now, I think it's already been a crossover, but I'm biased because I'm in the open source industry. When we look at our data, we did, again, our 2019 open source database survey, we're seeing that the adoption of open source databases is increasing in about half of the companies that were surveyed. About the other half, that's where they were about staying the same. There were a few who didn't know, a few that were seeing it decrease, but very few see open source databases decreasing. it is increasing or staying the same at the very least. And this is not just a single database, though. This is multi-database, right? And I talked about the inheritance issue where we're now inheriting what developers and architects are choosing. It's the same thing here in the database space. 92% of companies are running more than one database. 89% have more than one open source database, right? So there is no one single database to rule them all. It's which database is best for your application. And if you've got 10 applications, you might have 10 different database engines behind those. And that's a new normal, and that's a new thing that we have to deal with as an industry. And that's going to put a lot of strain on a lot of IT departments. And when I talk about, those databases, even like when we're talking MySQL versus Postgres, okay, that's a very different database, but we're starting to see even database families diverge. Okay, I did this graph and I showed this last year as well, but I like this because people look at it and go, it's an eyesore. And it's really hard to read, and I don't expect you to read it. This is the different variants of MySQL up until the point where I got sick of listing them. But you can see each one of these trees is a slightly different version of MySQL that will have different properties and operate slightly differently. And every time you go down this tree, whether it is running, MySQL in, Azure, on a compute instance, or running MySQL in their SQL, database as a service offering, or the Aurora version of MySQL, the open source compatible version. Each one of those is a slightly different variant and behaves slightly different and has different operating, potentially operating, rules. And so going down each one of these paths, it's no longer like, hey, I'm a MySQL user, because you might have a completely different experience moving to a different cloud provider running a slightly different variant. And it's really complex now. And so this is leading to even more complexity. Now, when we talk about the individual databases, we went ahead and put the Percona survey and the DB Engines and the Stack Overflow survey, 3 real popular areas to get database growth and metrics. And we kind of put them side by side. And what's interesting here is the first 2 are, consistent across all 3. MySQL is by far still the most popular of the open source databases. According to DB Engines, it's 2x actually. Postgres is growing, and it is a solid number 2, and it continues to increase. Now, it's interesting. Our survey shows that Redis, Maria, Elastic, and Mongo are pretty bunched together within 2 percentage points. So they're almost all as equally as popular for that kind of 3rd spot. But in DB Engines and Stack Overflow, Mongo is clearly the number 3. And when Stack Overflow, which is a little bit more developer-centric, Redis comes in number 4, which is interesting. And I'll talk about some of these in a second. But it is interesting to note that MySQL is still the biggest. Postgres is the fastest growing. MongoDB tends to have a lot of following, especially in the development space. Redis is used in conjunction with all of these quite extensively. Same thing with Elasticsearch. Now, looking at the 4 that we typically focus on here at Percona, you can see, MySQL, Postgres, MongoDB. This is from DB Engines. They're 1, 2, 3. Maria's way down there in terms of popularity, but they're growing quite a bit. But MySQL is still very, very popular. It still has the most install base. When you look at Stack Overflow, and this is surveying developers, you can see that MySQL has decreased a bit, okay, about 4% from year over year, while Postgres has picked up, 1.5%. Mongo has dipped just a little bit, and Maria has gone up. So, it's fairly consistent depending on how, across all of these different surveys, that the story is still the same, right? Maria is still out there and it's growing, but it's growing at an organic rate. It's still smaller, still has a ways to make up. Mongo's pretty stable, maybe a little decrease. MySQL has a huge install base, seen some decrease, but it's not massive, still massive install base, and Postgres is definitely seeing that increase. Now, I'm going to go through each of these and talk a little bit about some of what we're seeing in the industry and give you some highlights here. And so we'll start with MySQL, right? I mentioned largest install base. Now, we talk to a lot of cloud providers. We're partnered with a lot of cloud providers, and every one of them unequivocally says MySQL has the largest reach, right? It has more installed than anywhere, any of the other databases. It's, definitely the most used out there. It has a great amount of third-party support, which lends it to very easily, if you're going to add a third-party app, if you're going to do WordPress, you're going to do, Magento, you're going to do, some other applications. It's very easy to find that they support MySQL, and so it makes it a very popular target to spin up and use. All the major cloud providers have their own databases of service around MySQL, so it's, the capabilities are there to support those third-party apps. Popularity is pretty steady. Dipping, we're not seeing as much of a dippage as other folks are, survey-wise, but I would say statistically it's very minor dip, but it's still 2 times the next database, right? So it's still pretty big. Really well-established community. So if you're thinking of using this and you want to plug into the community resources, MySQL has a fantastic community, very open, very broad, global reach. This is also, of the open source databases, the easiest to find the skill set for. When you're talking about expertise, it's very, very difficult to find expertise in a lot of these open source databases. MySQL tends to be the one that you can find those resources easier. But keep in mind that people who tend to go, like, I'm going to migrate this legacy app and try and move it to MySQL, it's not as straightforward a migration as let's say Postgres, right? And so that's caused some people to have issues as they try to do massive legacy migrations. Now, future for MySQL, where MySQL is headed, they're really focused on a lot of developer-friendly features, making things easier for developers. And so we continue to see, that evolve and increase. Postgres, fastest growing database by far. More people are looking to move from proprietary databases to Postgres than any other open source database. It's the #1 target. I've heard this from cloud providers as I've talked to them. They're saying, oh my God, this is where Postgres, where we're getting most of our traction, moving from Oracle or SQL Server or other proprietary databases. Also talking with analysts, so whether you're talking with the Gartner, the 451s, the IDCs, I hear this over and over again where they're saying this is the #1 inquired about open source database right now. So this is where people are seeing that growth in the enterprise space. This is where their focus is. So this is a great place for legacy migration targets. So if you're looking to migrate from legacy databases, this is a really good place to start. There is a strong, technically deep community. There are a lot of great Postgres developers and contributors. Postgres has the most open of all the communities. Okay, and they have a lot of support providers and service providers you could plug into. It's also easier for a lot of Oracle DBAs to understand and get on board with Postgres than it is MySQL or Mongo. A lot of the concepts are very similar, and it's very structured in that way. So where does the future hold? You're going to still see the growth here, but we're seeing more and more vendors start to create their own proprietary or open source compatible versions of Postgres, right? And why is that? Because Postgres has the most unrestricted, it's the most open of all the licenses of these databases. It is very open. You can take it, you can modify it, and you don't have to, pay it forward or pay it left like you do MySQL, or there isn't the SSPL issues that Mongo has. So Postgres is being, seeing a lot of growth, especially in that enterprise place. MongoDB. So for MongoDB, their focus is really on Atlas, and this is where their database as a service and trying to make it easier has a strong play. And so Mongo was built around, targeting developers, right? They've always been about making things super developer friendly. And that continues with their focus on Atlas, right? And this is really developer friendly from a NoSQL and a document store perspective. It's very easy. The language for a lot of developers is natural. The format that data is stored in is very natural. It's a BSON, very JSON-like compatibility. So it's something that they're very focused on. Now we are seeing the increase. Now when you look though, the percentage increase quarter over quarter that they've reported is decreasing a little bit. I mean, it's not decreasing, it's still increasing, but it's gone from like, 12% quarter over quarter to like 5% quarter over quarter. So might be slowing a little bit there. And we are seeing some competitors jump into the space to try and steal some of this business. Amazon has their document DB. And, we know that Microsoft also has Cosmos, and there's other things that are starting to compete for the same space. This is a tightly controlled community. So of the different open source vendors, Mongo tends to keep their community very tight to the chest, right? They're not as open as some of the other vendors are in terms of contributions and openness to third-party vendors. But they are very focused on their revenue growth. They're the only one of them we'll talk about that are truly driven by Wall Street. And so they have projections and revenue forecasts to hit. And so it's very evident when you start to read some of their material and their projections, that's where their focus is. Now, we have the SSPL, and so moving from SSPL to AGPL, so licensing changes there, what does that mean? We're getting a lot of people who are still confused by that. So it's something to keep in mind, and there's a question whether it's really open or not. But Mongo is also very focused on becoming a platform, right? They want to become a platform for application development. They just don't want to be a database provider. And their focus on Atlas and their focus on that platform, it has a very Oracle-like feel, and I don't mean that necessarily in a negative way, but if you think about Oracle in the past, they started as a database provider and really branched out into, a lot of different business software. And I see that Mongo is moving more towards that platform, and databases still core to their business. It's just not the business. And so you're starting to see more. MariaDB, so default in most Linux distributions, so it's got a pretty big install base already, but it's no longer tied to MySQL. And there's still a perception for a lot of people that it is, but they have diverged enough where they're no longer trying to keep up compatibility with MySQL. And there's some things that MySQL is doing that they're just not going to do in Maria, and they're not going to try to. So it really has diverged completely. And so that's a good and bad thing in a lot of respects. So while we have seen growth, it still lags in popularity, and we haven't seen the enterprise adoption as much as we have for Postgres or for MySQL. We see that they've just launched their new database as a service because everyone's in this space, and it's competing with some of the cloud providers now, and so they're going to go head to head with that. And so it will be interesting to see where some of the new features show up. Are they going to follow a Mongo path where it is going to show up in Atlas, where a lot of new features for MongoDB are showing up in MongoDB Atlas, or are they going to follow more of a path where those features are going to be in their open source versions and available to everyone to run on their own? They tend to be known for pushing the envelope. They have a lot of interesting features that come out first and a lot of experimental things. So if you're looking to push the envelope, they get a lot of interesting things in their space. They have a very willing and engaging community as well. But be mindful, there is a difference between MariaDB Corp and Foundation. It's confusing for some people. The Foundation controls the open source branches, and they do a lot of work with the community to include a lot of the open source into MariaDB proper. Corp is where the business arm is, and that's where they sell their enterprise versions and have the SkySQL database as a service. So there is kind of a split there. Licensing wise, they're experimenting. They've put out the BSL, and so they're also doing the database as a service. So it would be interesting to see. They have an eventually open source license with BSL, so just be mindful of that. So where we see their future is they're going to be heavy leveraging SkySQL, and that's where a lot of their focus is going to be. They'll continue to push out their builds, but I think that they're going to really try to push into that enterprise space more and more. And you've seen that with their messaging over the last year, where they've really been trying to target, smart transactions and marketing towards that enterprise space. But they're going to continue to do that and do that in that SkySQL database as a service space. Now, where does Percona fit in all this? Because here we are, Percona. So we believe that all of those databases are going to continue to grow, and they're going to continue to win. right? We want open source databases to grow. And we believe that people are going to choose the best tool for the job, and they're going to be on the platform that they're the most comfortable with, whether that's AWS, Azure, GCP, or any of the smaller cloud providers. They're going to be in all these different places. That's okay. And you're always going to be looking for ways to run more efficient, resilient, secure, performant databases. Okay, and we know that people want those in an enterprise package. We know that they're expecting open, right? And we know that all of this complexity, all of this new stuff, somebody has to manage it. And so this is where Percona, and we'll talk a little bit about us and where we fit into this. This is where we come into play. When we talk about the databases that are out there, when we talk about whether it's Postgres or whether we talk about MySQL or MongoDB, we've always tried to take what's out there in the open space and make it more readily available and put it in a free package. So how we build our software for MySQL, for Maria, or for Mongo, for Postgres, we take those community versions, we start with that, and then we add in bug fixes and we add in enterprise features and scalability things to make those industry trends less impactful on your business. And then we'll package it and give it away all for free, right? It's in the free open source version. If we ship it, it's out there, it's free. Now, we think that, where our role in this all is to be very community focused, not tied to one technology. Provide our expertise to, you guys as a whole, to be experts in scale and performance, but support those upstream vendors as well. Provide them with, feedback and fixes and patches and things that help them, but keep them honest so they don't take advantage of the consumer, right? We want to make things easier for you as a community. So our focus, where we're going to be focused over the next couple of years, is taking all that complexity that we showed you and all these different database technologies, and how do we make it easier for you as a DBA, as an IT department, as an infrastructure team to manage and to get the most out of those. I think that's going to be really, really important. Now, let me go through where our insight and where we would recommend you take a look and where we recommend these trends are happening, and then we can ask some questions if you have any questions. So first, on open source, I don't think there's any doubt that we think that open source is growing and going to continue to grow. When we talk about the growth of open source, especially in the database space, you're going to continue to see that trend. You're going to continue to see applications migrate, but large complex applications, they're still not moving in mass yet, right? They're going to be opportunistic. If you're redoing an entire application, that's a big, massive, app for you guys, that is going to be an opportunistic upgrade where you're going to redo the application and choose an open source database. That's going to be fairly straightforward. If you're doing lift and shift, those are much more difficult with the larger enterprise applications, and those still aren't moving in mass yet. Small, medium-sized applications, those are where you're seeing more of that migration work. But we're seeing more and more of open source proprietary side by side. So we firmly recommend people look at open source technologies as they're modernizing their applications, as they're going through massive undertakings to rebuild big applications. However, if you're looking to migrate en masse and you're thinking of a lift and shift of a massive application, realize it's going to be more complicated than just clicking a button or running some configuration wizard. It's important to realize that. On databases, where we see the industry going is database environments are becoming more and more complex and larger, right? We're not getting smaller database environments, we're getting larger, more diverse. There's no one database to consolidate around. Developers are going to have a lot of say in those choices, and you're going to have to realize you're going to inherit some technology you might not understand or want, and you're going to have to adapt quickly. The right database can accelerate applications and accelerate revenue for a lot of people. And so you have to realize that that's going to drive more decision making than not. And be mindful of what licensing you're going to introduce into the system and what the implications are. On cloud and database as a service, you're still going to see these trends of database providers and cloud providers, working with and against each other and having this frenemy relationship in some cases just an enemy relationship. And this feud is going to cause a lot of confusion, and you're going to have to make decisions on how and where to run things, and whether you want to consolidate or expand and have a more diverse footprint. it's not going to be easy to consolidate on only one vendor in the cloud. And so you're going to see more and more of multi-cloud hedging, and you're going to see, the multi-cloud grow, and it's going to be more of the new normal for people. And while database as a service starts to increase, people are going to start to look at that as I'm locking in to that one cloud vendor. And if you're trying to go multi-cloud, it's going to be harder to choose that database as a service provider for that one vendor when you want to run cross-cloud. So that is something to keep an eye on. On cloud-native Kubernetes, this is becoming the de facto standard for that multi-cloud environment for a lot of people. This is where companies that are looking at running thousands or tens of thousands of databases, which is actually more and more common, this is a tool that they're going to use to help manage those environments. Not only manage the thousands of application heads that they have, also the thousands of database nodes that they have as well. This is also going to help enable that portability between cloud providers. So where we're headed, a lot of more open source versus not, sort of open source. New forms of vendor lock-in we have to watch out for. More complexity, not less. How companies, use databases, how many they'll use, where they'll use them, that's all evolving. And of course, the hybrid multi-cloud deployments becoming the new normal. And then we've still got those trends of data being leaked and slowdowns and outages that we have to deal with. So if you haven't finished, and taken our survey yet, I would encourage you to take a moment. It'll take you about 10-15 minutes to answer our open source data management survey. And this will really help us out. This is all anonymous and it's all given away free for the community. Everyone can download the data, they can use the data. We've heard from other vendors who use the data for helping build better open source projects, open source data, database, trends. The press uses this to, help highlight, where things are going. Analysts use this. So this is very valuable data and it's all open, it's all free data, but we're not collecting anything that's proprietary to you. So we really ask you to help us out. So that being said, let's take a moment and see, Kim, do we have any questions? I do not see any questions, but that doesn't mean there are none.
We did have some questions come through, and I do want to just add a note. Sorry, I got a little spacey there for a minute. I dropped the link for the survey into the chat window. So if you want to take it now, you can. There's a link and you guys are all available to go. And let me see on the questions. And we had said earlier, feel free to drop them if you haven't quite yet. But there is one here. Let me ask it to you. All right. Oh, yes, we've got a couple that have come in since then. Great. Okay, so will database and containers Kubernetes support 24/7 online schema changes like adding indexes, modifying primary keys, etc.?
They'll have to, right? I mean, I think that as this becomes the de facto standard for a lot of database deployments, the common methods that we use within our standard on-prem or virtualized or in the cloud databases, we have to do in Kubernetes as well. And you're starting to see a lot of other database providers build their databases of service on Kubernetes as a backend. I know like PlanetScale has talked about their deployments using Kubernetes. MariaDB, their SkySQL is built on Kubernetes. So these database technologies and these database vendors, they're building enterprise class 24/7 workload available systems. So we're going to have to support those. So yes.
Okay, so we've had a couple more questions come through. I'm going to read this one, Matt, but feel free to let me know if you need clarification.
Okay.
Would you share the functionality comparison of the mentioned RDBMS OSSDBs? And then could you talk about functionality trends and what vendors are kind of most invested or are moving in the right direction?
Well, that is actually a great topic for a takeaway blog or like a follow-up webinar, because I think there's a lot of nuance between the different databases, right? So, and I think the question here is really about, can we compare and contrast, Postgres, MySQL, MongoDB, and which features and where the gaps are in each of them. And I think that's where the question's coming from, and where each of those is a good fit. And we cover a little of that in our blog series already, but it's more on the high-level business functionality as opposed for the technical feature set. And from a technical feature set, that's where there are a lot of nuances and difference. Now, what's interesting is you can do probably a really long series just comparing something like Maria and MySQL now. Even though they're kind of from the same original code base, they've diverged so much that you will see quite a few technical differences in implementations and what they're good at and what they're not. And so, each individual database in comparison, that could be something in and of itself. It might be interesting for us to look at if there's a way to make that more of like a tool where you can just like choose database A and B and then compare the two, side-by-side feature set. But I will refrain from answering that in any more detail and say that would be a really good takeaway. And let's see if we can get someone to maybe write up a couple blogs or a series that go more into the details there.
Okay, I think it's a great idea too. So hopefully we can get that in the works. We do have a couple more questions. One, I'm gonna get a little shout out because you got a shout out for your Browns, and I'm a fan as well. So one of our guests said, "Go Browns." So yes.
Oh, there you go.
Okay, so I'm confused on to what is. I'm sorry. Let me see. Somebody just put another question and it jumped the screen on me. Let me start again.
Oh, hate when that happens.
I know. Okay. So I'm very confused on what is Kubernetes and how is it becoming more useful and how is it helping in scalability? Wouldn't we need horizontal scalability to do the work without Kubernetes?
So I'll answer the Kubernetes question in the 30 seconds or less here. So just so if you're not familiar with Kubernetes, and containerization. So containers are a small segment that you can run, individual services in. Think of it as a walled off, little place where you can run an application that has its own resources. It's kind of an evolution or a smaller component than a virtual machine. And as you build applications, thinking of, an application will have, a specific service in a container. That particular container will have, let's say, a service that is designed to do one particular thing, and you add more nodes to that so you can scale across those. And then if one of them fails, another one can automatically start up and you can replace those nodes. So a lot of applications follow that kind of cloud native type of setup where it's adding small little, microservices, if you will, in containers, and then they'll spin up and down as need be. And when we talk about databases, you can do the same thing. You can run your database engine in a container. But the question is, as you start to scale out your applications and as you start to add many of these, how do you typically manage that massive scale out? And Kubernetes is a tool that helps with the orchestration and helps with the adding and removing and bringing, nodes up and down in the application space. It can also be used in the database space where you have database clusters. You can add nodes to the cluster, you can remove nodes to the cluster, and Kubernetes is basically the controller plane, if you will, to control spinning up and down those individual nodes and those individual services. And so by using a technology like Kubernetes, you could have thousands of databases that you have to support, but you get a very database as a service-like interface where you can say, I want a new database that has 5 nodes, and I want it to be automatically backed up and have all this other component there. And then if one of the nodes fails, it can automatically restart and so on and so forth. That was a very wordy kind of rambling answer, but that's generally the idea. I would generally ask if that answered the question, but we'll move on to the next question. But it is something that a lot of people are starting to look at.
Great, thanks, Matt. What's the #1 feature of Atlas which is driving increased demand?
So I think I don't think there's any one feature. I think this is the database as a service, right? So think of it like this. MongoDB is really designed to be a wonderful tool for developers to use. It is super easy for them to get started. And developers, typically they're not, they don't want to think about the database. They don't want to think about the infrastructure. They don't want to think about things like security or backups, things like that. And so by giving them a service where, Mongo will take care of, MongoDB, the company will take care of some of those components for them, where they can take the burden of having to do patching or having to do backups or, having that infrastructure set up, it's a value prop that really entices them. But it's the same thing that you see with database as a service with RDS Aurora and Microsoft's database as a service, their SQL database or GCP Cloud SQL, right? It's the growth of the database as a service more than anything. But Mongo's popularity is really driven a lot by developers and by how easy it is to get started and make changes. Their back end and how they store data is very native-like to how developers think and how they code. So it makes it super easy.
Okay, great. Thanks, Matt. And we have one more question. So can containers be used for large databases, or are they just suited for microservice apps with smaller data?
So it depends. And so, we know of people who are running large databases in containers. So we do know that they're there. Has all of the container and operator technology been baked in enough to run, massive scale? Again, it depends on what you consider massive scale. So we see this as an evolution, and we definitely see large applications that are successful running in containers, and we have people who don't have problems with that. But we recommend, as with any technology that advances, that we spend some time and understand the workload requirements for it. And I think that, from a containerization perspective, we do see massive workloads already in containers, and we don't see that trend going away.
Excellent. All right. Well, that was our last question. So thanks a lot, Matt, for your time. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you at another webinar in the future.
All right. Thanks everybody.
All right. Bye.